Welcome back to the Fly Culture Podcast with me, your host, Pete Tigers. I'd like to start with some housekeeping and say a huge thank you to the people who have sent messages saying how much they are enjoying both the podcast and the magazine. I'm truly humbled and thank you from the bottom of my heart. Thank you for all the support. I just love doing these things and being part of our community, and they'll continue for as long as I can manage doing them. So thank you for that. And so on to today's podcast. I'm excited to be rejoined by my guest today, who has had a huge impact on me as a trout angler, and I'm sure many others too. I wanted to see what he's been up to since we last spoke, and it's my great pleasure to welcome Bob Wyatt back to the podcast. Bob, thanks for dropping by again. Is all good with you?
Well, my pleasure, Pete. Always pleasant to talk to you, and everything's good with me. Getting old now, so some things aren't as good as they used to be, that is for sure. But yeah, all good, relatively.
I'm pleased to hear that, and I guess I'm with you as well. We're all getting a little bit older, aren't we? And a little bit creakier and a little bit crankier, but we hang in there, and I think fishing keeps us going, doesn't it?
That's for sure. That's for sure, Pete.
So are you getting some fishing in?
Yes, yeah. I've had I'm not doing the sort of as much of the regular weekly fishing as I used to, but I'm getting in some good trips. Started off this season with New Zealand and fished there from, when was it, about the middle of March about the middle of March, about 6 weeks anyway. Sometime, I forget when actually I went over now, but it was sometime in March to sometime in April, and caught that's when down there, that's for the rivers that I fish there anyway. The late season, sort of April really, and a little bit later is actually the best. But when you're with anybody else, my brother went with me, and he likes to keep it a little bit summery, and the days are still a little bit longer. But you start getting some decent hatches again. Same as here. It's exactly the same as here, really. So we try to fish as late as possible and still keep it on a sort of a holiday footing. I would stay later. I used to fish right into May, and then you get pretty decent hatches still. So we did that, and it was kind of an interesting trip in many ways. The personnel is changing gradually. Some people are getting old, some people have dropped away. I don't see much of them anymore, and there's some new characters have showed up in this. It's based in this little almost ghost town village called Balfour down on the Matara, and there's a couple of guys there. They own a house, and one of them lives there full time. The rest of it just come and go. So it's a great situation. So you see some regulars showing up regularly, and we have a great time. Long late evenings and fishing every day. So you get a lot in 6 weeks. And most of that is spent fishing every day. So it's sort of exhausting at the same time, but it's always great. So I really look forward to that. Sort of a regular trip for me. And then my friend Bob Morton and I went over to try. I'd never fished it, but I've also wanted to give Loch Sheelan a go for the mayfly. So we spent a week there and really got spanked pretty badly. I mean, this the worst. So, but I could say it wasn't on is no exaggeration. It was just absolutely dead. There were one or two fish being caught, though. We did see a couple of rises, but in a week of fishing, that's not a lot to go on. It was the weather that did it. I think there were enough mayfly, around in the evenings. I was really hoping for some sort of, the classic spent gnat situation where you're, fishing to these cruising fish, working on the surface spinners. But that didn't really happen. It's a couple of rises, so it was really tough, really tough. We bailed a bit early. We bailed a deer so early. And then the two of us went up to Orkney recently. That's another regular trip, sort of the last week of June. And it wasn't great either. The water was, we got good. There's always plenty of fish, but we normally like to fish from the bank because you get to wade and just take it easy. You're not always fighting the boat and stuff like this. So, but we got quite a few fish, but nothing like it has been over the last 5 or 6 years. And I think it was mostly a water temperature thing. The water was really felt quite lukewarm, although the air temperature was quite low. And the old saying, as long as the air temperature is colder than the water temperature, it's never really very good. It's actually an old salmon fisher's, maxim, but I think it works with trout as well. You like to keep the air just a bit warmer and a rising water temperature. But up there, I think the fish start moving off into this it's not a deep lake, but the fish start moving offshore a bit as the water warms up. So you have to wait till evening. So in end of June, that makes for a long day by the time the fish starts showing up. So it's another exhausting trip. So I'm mostly sort of exhausting myself fishing these days. And I'm looking forward to maybe a bit of salmon fishing coming up, maybe later this month and into September on a couple of local rivers here. So yeah, that's been the season so far. So not an exceptional season for fish, but enough fishing, that's for sure. Getting lots of fishing.
That sounds a really nice mix as well. And I wanted to circle back round to New Zealand. Folks, before we move on, if Bob Wyatt's getting spacked by the fish, there's hope for us all. So there we go. So that makes me feel a lot better as well. But I wanted to circle back round to New Zealand and ask you a little bit about that. And you obviously used to live there as well. How does it feel when you get back there? Does it sort of kind of feel almost like a second home still? And do you enjoy it in the same way? And how is the fishing comparable as well? Have you seen improvements, declines, hatches, those sorts of things? Do you have any observations from that?
Oh, yeah, I've got quite a few, actually. My first trip to New Zealand from here was in 1999. I made my first trip there. And my first impression there was, I felt like, God, why had I waited so long? I felt like I really should have been there 10 years earlier at least, should have made a move. And I've gone every year since then. So for a while I was going twice a year. So it really got to me. I thought there's an odd feeling back then, almost of funny nostalgic feeling, because even as late as that, by 2000, that New Zealand still had a funny old-fashioned feel, the South Island particularly, had this funny old-fashioned feeling to it. It felt a bit 60s-ish or early 70s-ish, so if you're old enough to remember those days. But it was that. So, and it was great, and there weren't that many people around. I mean, I'd fish miles of river and never see an angler. That's as recent as that. So that has changed radically in the last 25 years. It's quite a different situation now. And it has caused, as you'd expect, it's caused some friction with locals. There's been a lot of overseas anglers visiting. I'd say mostly from Australia, but quite a few Americans and British and European anglers as well. So the rivers have become quite busy now, especially through the prime trout season. And a lot of the locals feel a bit, and I think they are crowded out. They have been crowded out. Say the Matara, which is a terrific river, but it's very heavily pressured. It's such a classic river, and the guides use it, of course. It's just one part of the routine, fish there. That's one of the 2 or 3 rivers that just get constantly fished, guided fishermen. So that's caused a lot of the friction. But so there's been changes. The gradually trying to find some sort of balance. This has happened in quite a few places. British Columbia, for sure. They've tried to find some balance between visitors and locals, and it never really works to anybody's real advantage. But it's caused a bit of friction. So they quite recently, like a couple of weeks ago, they brought in new Well, I think had they brought it in, they might have brought it in even when I was there. They brought in this new regulation on a couple of the rivers. They've reclassified the rivers, these popular rivers, like they had in British Columbia, where the same problem arose. And they've now got a kind of apart from raising license fees for visitors, which doesn't really matter that much because if you've flown to New Zealand, you're prepared to pay a couple $100 for your license. But they've sort of allocated a beat system to, say, the Matara, maybe on one or two others too. The Oredi, which is a famous big fish river, and the Matara gets a lot of pressure. So they tried this beat system. It doesn't really work because they're sort of irregular beats. Some people fish fast, some people fish slow. Some people it just feels like you can't walk up to a certain point, especially New Zealand anglers, Kiwi anglers. Don't like this at all because it's probably unreasonable. They've always reckoned that if you got onto a river first, you basically had the whole river to yourself. You can't do that anywhere in the world, but so they've had to balance this off a bit. So there's been people have bumped heads now and then there. And so that's that side of it. That's the pressure side. But there's been other pressures since I started going 25 years. The big change has been the effect of industrial dairy farming on those rivers. I think I mentioned this in the last podcast. But that's the same, and dairy farming is a huge industry there, and that has really affected the rivers. So they're not what they were 25 years ago. Nothing is, mind you, let's face it, but it's been quite a drastic decline in many ways. Primarily, I think the dairy farming on those lowland rivers, which are your classic trout rivers. The high country rivers aren't affected by that, of course, back in the hills and mountains. But they get a lot of pressure. There's fewer fish. That's where the big fish are caught. But they get a tremendous amount of pressure. So they've had to work that out somehow. But just the decline of the water quality in a lot of the rivers is pretty severe. I think I forget what the statistics are on that, but I could look them up for you. Actually, I should have actually made a note of that for this. Because the water quality on New Zealand farmland rivers, those are the real classic fly rivers, is getting to be quite poor, and also there's been terrific flooding. Why I don't know. In Canada, it used to be because of logging in the mountains. You get this every time there's a heavy rain. These floods come up and they scour the rivers. Well, there's been tremendous scouring of some of these rivers too. So this reduces. Oh, there goes the dog. This reduces the amount of habitat. Basically, as simple as that. Although there's where you have good stretches of the river with good habitat and a good bottom that isn't silted up or anything, the fishing is still superb. Really, you get good fish. They're healthy. There doesn't seem to be as many of them. But the main thing is there's not as much of that water on even some of the top rivers as there was 20 years ago. It's quite a decline that way. I don't know what can be done about that, except I guess what they're trying to do is just regulate the amount of fishing pressure on them. But that's not the real problem, because if there was more habitat, of course, people get to spread out, give lots of room. You only need a few hundred meters of river, really, when a hatch starts, and that's plenty. You can stand in one spot in a hatch and fish for hours. So there's that. You can still do that, and I do. The guys I fish with down there, we know places where you can go there, and you're not bothered by anybody, and we're not bothering anybody either. What I did find is I'm fishing we're not fishing sort of the first class rivers anymore. We're fishing the second class rivers and getting more fishing. Fishing is very good, and you work a little harder and maybe walk a bit further, and you have to sneak around a bit and talk to farmers and things, but it still gets some excellent fishing, and so we did. And then we had the weather was a factor on this past trip, and as it always is everywhere when you're fishing. So I would say that's my favorite time of year to go, but it's a bit of a gamble because you can get bad weather down there. It's a bit like Scotland that way. You can get a couple of weeks of rain and flooding, and you're kind of twiddling your thumbs and looking for, fishing the edges of places and finding wee creeks to find a fish or two in. So it was a pretty good balance this time. We had some excellent fishing, and we saw some pretty good hatches. So I wouldn't discourage anyone from going, but I think you have to go with your eyes open now. It's not what it was when I first started going. It's changed quite a bit. It's very busy. Places like Wanaka and Queenstown have exploded. They're big. They're cities now. And there's a lot of commercial enterprise going on in these places that 20 years ago there just wasn't. They were tiny little bucolic towns. They were lovely. So that's all changed. So, but I'll be probably going again this spring, or next spring. I'll be heading down there and seeing my friends who are, they're as old as I am and older. so things are slowing down a bit for us all. Yeah. Anyway, still good.
Good. And you make some really interesting points there as well, because it must be difficult, because I'm sure fishing helps local economies. So people are coming down for there. So you don't want to dissuade people coming down. But I also get the how local anglers are feeling, and that resentment, I hope, doesn't build into something greater, and I can understand it to a degree, and on some of those rivers that you haven't got many fish to go round. So I understand it from that point of view. And the Ariti, I remember I wasn't down there a lot later than you, but you'd see the car park, and we saw there were cars in there, so we thought that's absolutely fine. Those guys got there earlier, we'll leave it to them. But I can see how that's got to be really carefully managed, hasn't it? The local versus incoming anglers. It's a tricky balance one to manage, isn't it?
Well, it's very tricky, actually, because there were days down there just this past time when on the Matara, that middle Matara, we couldn't find a place, because normally what you do is you see a car, you leave it, like you say, and you go on to the next stretch. And if all the access points had one or two cars in them, and so you don't just want to horn in on anybody, and so you might have to give it a pass that day, or go to another river entirely. That's what we normally do. So I think if you're prepared to do that and don't get too steamed up about it, I think it just reduces the atmosphere a bit. Not that there's a bad atmosphere, but occasionally there is. Guides complain about people jumping them, but there's been some complaints about the guides as well, being a little bit entitled, put it that way. So, but they look at it as that, well, I'm doing a job. I've got my clients here. They've come from across the pond or something, and just trying to give them a good day. So it's all you have to understand everybody's point of view, which is usually difficult if you just want to go fishing. But I think you have to. That's all there is to it, and be prepared to be flexible, and it should work out. The fish are there, and you don't need all the water that you used to get. That's for sure. So you can work it out, I think. And fishermen are generally fly fishermen are generally pretty reasonable, I think.
Yeah. Do you think then we are seeing this? You said about the towns there growing rapidly. Do you think that's a function of what we saw with COVID and people moving out to these places? And the reason I asked that was that I was looking at Reddit recently, or in the new year, I was trying to steer clear of social media, and my daughter said, have a look at Reddit. And I was looking at that, and there's a fly fishing sub thread or whatever they call these things, and even American anglers were saying about the brown trout and calling them invasive fish, whereas you might read this a little way back that the brown trout there were targeted more so because they were slightly trickier to catch. But there was a little bit of a shift. And I wondered if that was as well something to do with post-COVID, more people moving to these areas, let's say Montana, Colorado, wherever those places may be, and being a little bit more, I want to choose the words really carefully, but perhaps territorial of their rivers in that sense. And it is public land, so I do understand. I'm trying to word it as carefully as possible, but I'm trying to understand if there is a shift in the feeling of fishing just a little bit in the last year or two, and coupled with what you said. I just wonder what your thoughts were about that.
Well, I would say, if anything, I would say the COVID experience, because people were sort of not doing it for a couple of years, probably did bring a bit of a bump in the numbers that suddenly got back onto the rivers. That is for sure. But the expansion of these places on the South Island, New Zealand, started quite a while ago, and they just accelerated. It's been exponential, really. So, and these aren't. I hesitate to say they're not working class, because in the case they are, but they're sort of well off working class, because if you can afford, a house in Wanaka, for instance, you've got a few bob. There's no doubt about it. It's very, very expensive, and that's who's coming there. And there's a bit of a prepper phenomenon going on, where a lot of retired people, of course, move to New Zealand, but a lot of fairly youngish people that go there because they just want their best life, and they can afford it, and that's where they go. And so it's really, exploded is the word, because it's really spread out. No one would recognize Wanaka now from even 6 years ago, say 5, 6 years ago. And that was a sleepy little, lovely little place. Even now it's very popular and crowded, and there are, there's big warehouse stores, shopping centers, and things that just didn't exist even that recently. So that, and all those people live there now. They live there, and they're there for a reason. A lot of them live there for the same reasons we go there. And they love the countryside, the fishing, the skiing, whatever it is. And so that's what you get. If you're there, you're there. So there's thousands and thousands of people there now, are all pretty well fixed, tooled up, eager, athletic, outdoorsy. That's why they're there. That's why they're there. So that's what you're going to get. So it's been great for that economy. There's no doubt about it. And lots of tourist-related jobs, thousands of them actually. So there's obviously an upside to it, but it is also pressure on everything. And I think it's been difficult for some people, especially the older crowd, to adjust to that change. That's understandable, but you do have to adjust. That's all there is to it. You have to, you got to change.
Yeah, you've got to roll with the changes. Absolutely. Now, I wanted to move on to the fishing there, because when you're down there, obviously you have a wonderful chance, and both of your books were set around some of the fishing down in New Zealand as well as other places as well. But are you still at this stage on this recent trip? Are you learning stuff? Are you making observations? Did you take anything from the last trip that you thought, oh, actually, yeah, that's something I'd not thought about before?
Yeah, well, definitely. Because one thing I know, the last few years there, when I was still living there, I not making a special project or anything, but I started on fishing the lakes, because I've got a friend, Ronan Crane. He's an Irish lad down there who's now guiding boat times. He's a great guy, and he's a terrific fisherman. And he's an Irish lake expert, right? And his father was. And his father's a guide in Ireland, so they really fish. And he couldn't understand why nobody in New Zealand fished the lakes, because still almost nobody fishes the lakes, which is ridiculous. There's all these lakes, and nobody fishes. They're all on the rivers. He said, this is crazy. So he bought an old boat and started exploring these lakes. And, of course, found that there's fantastic fishing in the lakes. So I like lake fishing as well, and I like fishing. It's okay. I had a boat there, but but I like prowling along the shores of a lake as well, just casting to spotting fish and casting to them, which is really a New Zealand thing. Spotting fish, casting to sighted fish. It's just a great sort of. I hesitate to call it a game, but it kind of is, because you don't have to do it that way. But what I noticed was how responsive these brown trout were to large streamers, right? Just fish along the shore. So I always caught a few that way. Anytime I do it, I always caught a few fish like that. And normally I was doing it when there was no surface activity. I was just going on casting, stripping streamers, and probably not that way. But it's been in my head for quite a few years now. But the season before, when I was down there, I hit a couple of big fish with these streamers in the rivers, just because nothing was happening at all. I thought, well, that looks like good one. I'm just going to put on a streamer and strip it through there, and wham, get these large fish too. So this year, I made a point of it. I said, I'm going to make a project out of this. And I tied up some monster streamers, Caligula style big streamers, right? Maybe not big for Caligula, because they're tiny. Out there, they're tiny, 6, 8 inch, 10 inch streamers. I just went reasonable ones, about 4 or 5 inches long, which is still big. So when we fish those rivers, it's normally a river. It's a hatch river, so we normally just fish it like we always fish it. The season before, I caught a couple of good big fish with a streamer when nothing else happened that day on this river. So I was going to do that again. So this time I tied up specifically flies for this trip and put them on first. And I took a heavier rod with me. I took an 8-weight with me with a super fast sinking tip, basically the tungsten tip on this fly line. So it's kind of a clumsy thing. But through a lot of effort, I got into rolling this thing out there and just making sort of quartering upstream casts actually, and stripping back as the fly was coming back down. And probably on the third cast, I caught a 7-pound beautiful fish. It actually looked like a sea run fish. I thought, okay, that's interesting. So, and then I walked down about another 50 yards, another good bit of water, and I caught another one. It wasn't that big, and he got off, but it was another big fish. So that just did it for me. So I said, okay, when I get back to school, this was late in my trip this year, I said, okay, I'm going to make streamers are now my project, right? So, because we've got a couple of rivers up here in Scotland. One of them, I won't name it, but it's a good trout river, and it has big fish in it, and they're occasionally caught. People that know the river catch them. No, I wouldn't say regularly, but they often. And what I know is that this river has vast shoals of minnow and whatever they are. I'm not sure what they are. That's something I still have to find out, just what these shoals of fish are that you see along. They look like reed beds sometimes. Just dark, massive fish along the shores. So obviously, as we know, when fish hit maybe the 3 or 4 pound mark, they switch over to feeding on bait fish. And occasionally they'll rise if there's lots of flies on them, but generally that's what you got to do. You got to feed the fish. So I made this surprise because I realized that these fish are eating this thing. And there may be a few boys now prowling the local rivers, usually fishing late into the evening with these big flies, and they're getting these big fish. And some guys are getting them with standard tactics, but the streamers are sort of just starting to catch on a wee bit here, just as a big fish project kind of thing. And it's working. So my next trip out, actually, I've got a big can of streamers that I've tied up. It's an old film can or something like that. I'm just absolutely stuffed with these things. I keep tying them, and I'm not using them as fast as I'm tying. But so that's an interesting thing for me now. So, and it's fun. It's just fun. So you have to start getting back to onto tackle for a bit. You have to rearrange your tackle. Maybe even take 2 outfits, I suppose, with you, and not carry them necessarily. But when you dedicate yourself to streamers, you should really tackle up for streamers and make a job of it. So that's kind of an interesting thing. I'm looking forward to that. the next trip out, I'm going to fish into the dark with these with these big things on these trout streams that we normally fish with size 16, emergers. So that's been a recent project of mine that I'm interested in. But that's fly fishing. I mean, you keep finding alleys to go up and find something out, and sometimes it works and other times it doesn't. But this definitely works. So I advise anybody if they think there's you'd want to do it if you've got any big trout in your river. Most of them have some. I think that's the way to get them, and you probably have to get comfortable fishing into the dark, I think. But so that's just a bit of fun thing. And tying streamers is great. That's a laugh, by the way, because you can be quite creative. And I haven't gone quite down to the extremes that Kelly Gallup has. Mine still look bait fishy, I think. But yeah. So anyway, that's fun.
That's really cool, because that's even for somebody like yourself as well, that we can find these new avenues or streets as you describe them, to have a look at. And that just keeps us enthused, excited and interested. And then there's everything that goes with that. It's the tackle, it's the tying, and it's the actual fishing. And I think that's why I love our pastime so much. There are so many places that we can visit, and it keeps us interested the whole time and keeps us challenged. I think it's the challenge that I love so much. And you touched on tackle a little bit there, and I know we were talking off mic, and I'm getting all misty-eyed after old rods that I'd sold on or moved on or haven't owned and fancied owning. And of course, with places like eBay and other places as well, there's the opportunity to find them. Do you find yourself that way as well, that you're searching those things out? And do you like to fish up-to-date stuff, or are you fishing what you've always used and worked? How do you approach?
Well, I sort of a blend of up-to-date stuff, and I wouldn't call it classic stuff anymore, although I went through a phase when I first moved to Scotland of buying old reels and rods. I bought cane rods and cane salmon rods and all kinds of reels. They were quite cheap for rod. No one was buying them, so you could buy these things for not next to nothing, but were unbelievably cheap. So I've had everything from little 7-foot, cane dry fly rods right up to 14-foot sharks spliced, which are, I think, frankly, impossible to fish with. So I advise anybody they're great, but they're unbelievably heavy compared to today's tackle. Although I'm sure they work fine. But reels are another matter. I got a lot of reels there, 20 years ago. Got a whole drawers full of them. Usually, the classic British ones, which are great reels. But I sort of winnowed that down to, I've got a couple of old Hardy St. George's and one or two salmon reels, but I've got rid of most of them, and now mine are all, they're not really contemporary, but I've sort of got some heavy old Abels that'll never wear out, and that's what I fish with, actually. That's what I use. And I use pretty up-to-date fly rods. They're just so great to fish with and to cast and manage line with. But although I certainly appreciate the I don't know what it is. It's there's several feelings you get when you're fishing with a good cane rod. There's no question of that. There's a lovely feeling that, well, this is the way it was done 100 years ago kind of feeling, which is always good. And but there's something about the feel of them, and I know that. And then, of course, is the craftsmanship. You have to appreciate that. They're fantastic things. But I have to admit, I just don't fish them anymore. I just fish pretty up-to-date carbon fiber, But there are differences in actions, My actions are now a little more classic than they were for a few years. I was going for very fast rods for a while, and that they've kind of eased up a bit. So yeah, that's what I fish with anyway, Peter. But I'm not using cane rods anymore. I've got a few still.
Yeah. They're always good to bring out. Yep. And I fish with mine a fair bit. Yeah, they're modern ones. But I was thinking some of the graphite rods that I've moved on over time as well. That, yeah, I'm just thinking, oh, Sage SP again. It'd be nice to cast one of those and try those and see how they feel. And if things, and we know with resin, with some of the technologies that we have now have made rods lighter and stronger as well. But it'd be fascinating to see if that can still perform in the way that, in my mind at least, it can still do that. So I may have a look at some more. It's a very dangerous rabbit hole to go down. So I'm approaching it, yeah, with great caution at the moment. But I want to, I'm sure we touched on this last time, but deer hair emerger, you must be incredibly proud. It's your fly pattern. You must have been incredibly proud of the impact that it's had on our community.
Well, you take pleasure in it, of course, but I like all the variations that are coming out of good ones too. Good, you can tell that people are really thinking that are tying these things. Some of them, I noticed a few of the fellas are sticking to the classic tying, I suppose, or at least the classic tying the second version of it the way I tie them now. But there's quite a few good variations on that standard design, which basically puts it in that whole clink hammer, sunk abdomen class of flies now, which are pretty basic for everybody's armory now. I mean, you just got to have them. You gotta fish those things. I don't mean the DHE in particular. I just mean that type of fly, whatever one you like. But the idea of it probably hasn't done much for the hackle industry, because I don't use hackles anymore at all. Which is, although I've got a drawer full of lovely capes, I'm gonna have to give those to somebody. But I just don't tie them at all on the dry fly. I just don't use them. So I think it's been a bit of an adventure for me. But I think the adventure part is nutting things out. That's such a huge part of fly fishing is identifying, I don't know, whatever it is, some aspect of it. I wouldn't call it an issue or a problem, but some aspect of trout behavior or salmon behavior, and then just nutting it out and following a line of inquiry, sort of, and then fantastically, you actually do come up with something, and you've got, what do you call it? You've got a peer group out there that will test it for you. It comes back pretty quickly if you're onto something. And of course, I'm not claiming any real originality of this thing, because I don't think creativity really works like that. It certainly didn't work. I taught art for so many years. I understand how creativity works, but it was based on ideas that other people have actually come up with or were close to it. Like Hans van Klinken with his revolutionary clink hammer, and Al Kochi and Fran Betters and a few of these boys in the States. They're coming up with these no hackle paradigms, and everybody's working around this roughly the same idea. And so mine was just a distillation of their ideas. That's what it was. And I think all flies are that anyway. That's just what they are. They're these objects that come out of that kind of inquiry and testing things out, and just pure, spitballing it. Sometimes you're just saying, I'm going to try this and see if that works. Although I don't do that much anymore. But what I do like is the idea of essential triggers in any fly that you try. It's got to have those. It can't all be just a color thing or whatever. It's got to have these 2 or 3 basic triggers, and then you go from there and do what you like with it. And some of these things make a difference. Color, I'm still not convinced how important it is, but obviously it makes a difference sometimes. And some of these boys fishing, actually I say boys, but it's mostly the boys that are fishing at the English reservoirs, come up with the damnedest things. I mean, a lot of it is on, maybe quite a bit of it's on stocked fish, which is a factor, but quite a bit of it isn't. They're naturalized fish, and they're feeding naturally. And they, through pure experimentation and failures, obviously, trying things out, they come up with these techniques that are really interesting. You're like, why? And anybody that gets into that, I mean, it will talk about rabbit holes. It just is that you just go down these things and you find yourself obsessed sort of with this, this set of techniques that you're trying to distill into a strategy, and then a set of tactics, and then patterns, and all the way down. And I love it. I was watching some videos a while ago before the Orkney trip, actually. Watching a couple of these fellas on, I forget which, it might have been Rutland down there, and some of the setups they're using for these buzzer hatches. I mean, they're onto it, and it's all about trout behavior and fly behavior and some of this. It's very little about the patterns are as simple as get out. I mean, they do have some odd things like boobies and various things like that that don't make any sense at all. But in most respects, at least I don't like them very much. But the stuff they're actually catching the fish on are dead simple. I mean, they couldn't be simpler. So it's all about their approach and their presentation and how they're fishing these things. And that's just interesting. So they're into trout behavior more than they are, fly tying culture, whatever it is, the traditions. They're into what the trout really are doing. And boy, it works. These things, they find things that really work. My pal Bob Morton was down there, I forget, with another buddy. Was it last year? I guess it was last year. They went down for the big buzzer hatch. I think it was Rutland. They were on, and they said these guys, they're hooked. I mean, you have to put it into its category, all right? It is a specialized kind of fishing, and the fish are they're not classically, you say, wild brown trout fishing and stuff like that. But once they're onto these, they've got these tactics figured out. They're catching dozens of fish a day. I mean, a 20 fish day is normal, and they hope to be much better than that. Some of them are getting 50 fish in a day. So whatever they're doing is definitely what the trout want. Right? So that apart, that's not really my kind of fishing, but there's something in there that I really find interesting. I really find that interesting. So you have to have this stuff. You have to keep it in your mind all the time. So if you're approaching a wild loch like Loch Harry up in Orkney, and it's what you're doing isn't working, you have to figure something out. And that is definitely a way to go. I mean, you'd have to think of something like they're doing, because it's all trout, and trout generally behave more or less the same. So that would be, I think, my next. We didn't use a boat this trip because it was just too windy, but I think next time if we get into a boat, I think I'll actually try some, not the extreme Rutland tactics, but something like that, some variation of that for these fish if they're not coming up to the classic, dry deer hair sedge, which is that's my go-to out there. Then you got to do something else to make it happen. That's just fly fishing. That's still, I find it as fascinating as I ever did. I do find it. It doesn't go away. It doesn't diminish. So I find that odd just in itself. Like,
yeah,
I don't know. It just doesn't.
That's nice. That was a wonderful insight into your thinking there. And you touched on Orkney and said about your deer hair sedge, and you talked about the lakes in New Zealand. I've not fished these sort of lochs, but I would think there probably isn't as much by way of fry. I could be completely wrong. Is that where your streamer approach could potentially work in there for something completely different? Smaller streamers, perhaps?
Yeah, no, bigger. I mean, big
Wow.
I don't think there's any sense messing around with small streamers, actually. I mean, you're looking for something that is now, looking for a fish that's now onto eating fish. And although these things don't necessarily look just like fish, they'll do some of the things that these bait fish do. They're triggering the same response. I've watched these fish, and I've seen them. One stands out in my mind. I was walking along the shores. I can't remember which lake it was now. Anyway, it's one of the big, very lakes far down south. I think it was Lake Monowai. We beached the boat. I was walking along a shingle shore looking for fish. And the fish are usually within about 6 to 8 feet off the shore. You see them there. in quite shallow water, just rooting around, and the brown trout. So I saw this. It was a good sized fish, maybe 5 pounds or something. Just cruising along very slowly. Obviously, not necessarily hunting, but had that look to him, like he was receptive. So I put on a woolly barker, right, and flung it out there, and he when it hit, he moved off sideways. It just disturbed him a bit. But boy, he came right back. He came right back and was hunting for that thing like a dog looking for a partridge or something. I mean, he was just rooting, like zigzagging back and forth and hunting this thing out. And I'd already picked it up. It was out now, and I was about to cast again. And he was so frustrated he couldn't find it. It seems like a ridiculous thing. We're talking about a fish, right? But he was. You could see it in his actions. He was frantically looking for this thing. He really wanted it. If he'd seen it the first time and hadn't just reacted to the plop of it landing near him, which is what I did, I just cast a bit too close to him. That spooked him a wee bit, but didn't entirely spook him. He came right back. Like, what was that? It might have been edible. So I think you have to think of, especially big trout like that. So there's no point of being too subtle with this, this stuff. And as a matter of one of the fairly early Kelly Gallup videos are good to watch because he talks about this, and he's got quite a style. Kelly does, and he's quite funny actually. And he talks about, he says, don't worry about your leader, the weight of your tippet or any of that stuff. You got 2 feet of 20-pound test on there. That's what you want. You just want to turn the fly over. This great big fly. You cast it in there, get 2 big strips. And he says, if he's going to take it, he's going to take it right now. And he's right. And so that's the way they float these rivers, doing that. They're just casting into the banks and stripping back. And it's not the most subtle form of fly fishing, no doubt about it. But it is quite exciting because you're pulling up fish you wouldn't normally get. They're hard to approach, except in that case with a drift boat. And walking on the shore, you're gonna have to put on a bit of put some mileage on, looking for these fishable spots, because a lot of these fish are in quite inaccessible spots. They're waiting till dark or something. So you have to really hunt them out. It's just a real hunting thing, less than a classic fly fishing thing where you've got rising fish in the Cassington, which of course is the creme de la creme. That's my favorite thing to do in the world, especially a spinner fall. To me, that's the best of it. I just love that more than anything in the world. But there's no denying it. I mean, checking these big stupid streamers out there, it's good fun. And you'll pull these big fish out, places you wouldn't expect it. In most rivers, they're there, all right. And up here in Scotland, because now, this is remarkable in itself, Pete, is the advent of catch and release. I remember not that long ago, people were actually objecting to it. And I remember Malcolm Greenhall writing an article about the disadvantages to the fishery of catch and release, because the fish would learn and all that sort of stuff. So anyway, you just forget about that. They don't. And what it did is it just stopped people from doing it. Not many, because gradually it just became the thing to do. Is you're going to catch a wild fish, and the famous Lee Wolf phrase that they're too important to kill, not to let go. What did he say?
Too important to catch once.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Something like that. So, I mean, and that's absolutely true. But now that's just what you do. Nobody kills these fish. Very few people kill fish in Scotland now. I mean, wild brown trout. I think that's amazing. That's amazing. Because what's happened is these rivers now that no one would have thought. I mean, you expected to catch trout that were 3 to a pound, maybe in most of these streams. You make it a half pounder. If you got a pounder, that was a trophy almost. Now that's just a trout, which is that's remarkable. And I know guys that are fishing very popular, almost urban rivers here. They're catching 2 and 3 and 4 pound trout out. They were unheard of 20 years ago. Unheard of. That was something that made it right to the Trout and Salmon, editor's page. You got a fish like that in Scotland. It didn't happen. except by salmon fishing, which was how, come to think of it, that's how this streamer fishing in these rivers first entered my mind. Because fishing for salmon up there in the salmon season, you would catch big brown trout on salmon flies. And if you ever talk to a gilly up there, they treat trout like vermin, just get them out of the river. But they would say their sports would frequently catch these great big trout that you'd never ever see, say on the Tay, which is not a particularly good trout river. But if you're going to get good fish out there, that's how they got them, on a 4-inch Waddington or 3-inch Waddington, rather than a nymph. So that's what I think that put the germ, in my head years and years and years ago. And so now that's just developed in this kind of interest in streamer fishing, but it's based on just an interest in trout behavior. It's just, that's what the trout are doing. So if you want to catch them, you're going to have to sort of, get into their heads a bit. So, yeah. Where were we?
Yeah, I like that a lot. And that moves nicely along as well, because we have a piece from you in the winter edition of Fly Culture. I wanted to ask you if you're doing much writing, and I'm sure I'm not alone in hoping that you'll add to trout hunting and what trout want at some stage. Is there any chance of that?
Well, oddly enough, I was approached by a fellow from Germany who is trying to get a German version of trout hunting published, and he's in the throes of talking to my publishers and trying to work something out. And I said, well, in principle, I've got nothing against that. I'm a little worried about, as you probably know, one thing about writing is you try, or at least you try and express the way you, through your writing, express the way you think and talk. So there's a certain tone that you have. And I use a lot of, I know I do it because I said, that doesn't sound right, so I'll rewrite it so that it sounds more like the way I'm talking right now. It's just kind of, like it's just chat. And even when you're writing the really specific, it's like technical stuff, because it can get very dry. You start skimming through this stuff. If you know it, you just don't read it. You just skim until you see something sort of interesting. That's where you read a lot of fishing stuff now. But so I was worried about that. I still am worried about that. I just don't know how this is going to translate. But anyway, that's a project. If that happens, so because of that, I dug out my early manuscript of trout hunting, which I started in, I think, about 2000. I think it was published in 2004, I think. And yes, and so I started reading through it and saying, "Gee, that's a bit wordy. That's a bit tendentious. That's a bit, just going through it." Did I actually say that? Did you say? So I started thinking, this needs a good clear out. This does before it's translated into German. That's for sure. So I wanted to simplify a bit of the language and do the publisher of that edition of trout hunting, the edition of trout hunting, was trying to make it all fit into 240 pages. So what he did, was just collapse 2 or 3 paragraphs into one paragraph. So you have these huge, long paragraphs, dense paragraphs. And that's a problem. So I said, I don't know what I'm going to have to do. I'm going to really have to edit this thing down especially if it's going to be translated. So that got me thinking again about writing. And I sent something to you that I'd been working on. It's the first chapter in trout hunting. I think it is called World Making. It's about what we're talking about now. This is fly fishing. What is it? Why is it? Why is it run so deep? Why does it last so long? Why is it always? It's as good as it ever was. For me, because I don't get out as much as I would have. Well, in a way, I do, because I make these big trips now instead of particular trips, rather going out, every week. So I think that's just an interesting thing, because I really can't think of anything else that's like it. You have football fans and things like that, but that's a passive occupation, being a football fan. It's as excited as you get, and active as you get in the stands or home in front of the television. It's not the same thing at all, because you're really actively integrated into the doing of fly fishing. And it's got so many aspects to it, just so many, so multifaceted. Any one of them, as we said, can take you down a particular rabbit hole for quite an extended period of time before you re-emerge, So, I mean, that's quite remarkable. And it's got such a fantastic tradition. It's got an unbelievable literature, this huge set of traditions that they're evolving. A lot of them aren't, but they drag up parts of the old traditions, like we fish a certain way. That's changing quite a bit, but it's still there. It's still there, and you've probably the best parts of it. This is my opinion. Is that, I mean, the best thing for me in the world is to be on a late afternoon of a spinner fall say on a New Zealand river, or even up here where you've got blueing olives or something coming up. Very difficult fishing. It's probably the most difficult of all of the situations you can be in. Doesn't last long, so you're kind of panicking the whole time, and just getting one or two fish. I mean, that is the best possible thing you can do in life, I think. So
I'm with you.
Nothing gives me more pleasure than that. And that's after, what is it now? Like, I'm 78 this year. I've been fishing since I was 10 years old. It's a long time. Not that I was fishing for spinners when I was 10, that is for sure. But that's a lot of fishing time. And for that feeling not to diminish after all those years is remarkable. I can't think of anything like it. Everything else is diminished. That's for sure.
Fantastic. Like that very, very much. And it is a wonderful, like you say, it's really hard to encapsulate what this pastime means to us. And I wrote something, a little while back now, not that long, a month ago, and saying that I'd had a brief falling out with my love of fishing for a very, very, it just lasted a matter of a week probably, but it was so profound that it had a massive impact on me for a week that I'm thinking, wow, I'm not feeling like I'm normal fishing. Over that period of time, have you had similar sort of very slight lapses in your relationship with fishing?
Let me think. I don't know, because there's always something else to do, So, and I've been lucky enough to have fished, in Western Canada and New Zealand and Australia for saltwater fishing a lot, and Scotland, which has been great. And they're all different, completely different fishing, paradigms, I guess you want to put it that way. They're quite different, but they've still got the basic, the basics of fly fishing in all of them. I mean, if just here, just a couple of hundred yards away from where I live here, there's a little bay, I live right on the coast. It's got a little village called Fairley, looking over the water there, and there's a mostly disused wharf that runs out into the sound here. And on the other side of that, there's a little bay, a little shallow bay. And one day, it's a couple of summers ago now, about this time of year, the tide had come in, and I noticed there were mullet feeding right up to the shore. You could get them easy. It's quite shallow, straight patch there. And I hadn't seen mullet up here before, and there they were. They're working away. And I just about turned around. I was driving. I just about turned around, went back, got a fly rod, and came down and have a go. So I'm still thinking of it to see if it's good. Maybe this week, if the weather stays warm and these fish come in and the tide's in, I might go down there with the fly just for a couple of hours and see if I can get a mullet. Now, I don't know what that is. I don't know why the appeal is so strong. Like the impulse, let's put it that way, just to go catch one of those things. I don't know. Just do it. And so that's what keeps it rolling along. And if you hit a spot where maybe things get a bit samey sometimes, but when I was living in New Zealand, of course, I got pretty casual about it because I could go anytime I wanted. There was a pretty good trout stream running just behind my place. But I didn't fish it. I would drive 2 hours to fish, down in Balfour, on Matara, where I should have just been walking out the door. So there's, I think it's just that sort of thing. You get overly familiar with a certain aspect of it, but you can mix it up pretty easily. Actually, I think in Britain, it depends where you're living. Of course, I'm lucky enough here. I still haven't gone after the mullet here, but I will. I'll give it a go. And that might become a thing. You see, there's a mullet thing. I read about them. These guys down there, they've cracked mullet fishing with fly. That's just that fascinates me. Yeah, right. Go do that. So I don't know if it's just a matter of just a fresh, I don't know, just some kind of intervention like that. But there always seems to be one to engage with, and they just keep presenting themselves.
Yeah.
So I think, I have to say, no, it hasn't really diminished. That hasn't diminished for me. It just keeps giving it. You get a lot out of it. So if you drive down to one of the local rivers here, it's a bit far for just an evening. So one good trout stream here is about 2.5 hour drive for me. So you go down for a half hour rise in the evening. You've got 5 hours of driving. That just does not make sense. I'm not being particularly green about it. I just mean that's just too far to drive. So there is that, because I don't have anything right at hand that I can get to in an hour from here. If you do, that's a lucky thing.
Yeah.
Well, you just put one of those big streamers on.
Yeah, I think that's probably the way. I think part of it is that I haven't tied a fly for, it must be almost 3 years now. And I think for me, that would give me something to do, because you know what it's like, and I'm sure many listeners as well, that my thought is always on fishing. And so that would, I better tie some. And I wonder if there's an element of that as well. So I'm looking at a vise now while we're talking that's covered in cobwebs and looks as though it came from a haunted house or something. But I may bring that out to play at some stage and go from there. But we've been talking over an hour, and I just wanted to, I thought it was important to bring it up before we start winding the chat down, that last time we spoke that you said a lot of your social media is about salmon farms at the moment. And since we last spoke, I wonder what your thoughts were now regarding salmon farms. Has anything changed? Is this challenge still very much in front of us? And are we going to be able to do anything about it?
Well, the challenge is very much in front of us, luckily, or not luckily, but through the efforts of some concerned people. It's the fight, I guess you want to put it that way, against at least the expansion of it, but going further than that, is getting a little bit better organized now. Wild Fish and Atlantic Salmon Trust and various people, I mean, they've got their ducks in a row now. We know the problems. You can't brush them under the carpet like the government is still doing, which is a huge problem. It's a big business in Scotland. It's referred to as some kind of Scottish industry, which it isn't. It's a Norwegian industry. The billionaires are Norwegian that are profiting from this. And although it provides a few jobs, some of them are quality jobs. You can't take that away from them. But the several thousand that they keep boasting about are temporary jobs, zero contract, relatively low. They're not great jobs. Feeding fish is not a great job. That's just that aspect of it. And the government keeps pushing it. They don't have a lot to push, I think, and that's one of them. They've made a success of that. They keep calling it sustainable, which it's not. So those are all the big issues. But there are things now that people are realizing are real. So much so that you may know that the Canadian government promised some years ago they were going to remove the West Coast fish farms from the water, and they had to be moved on land. Trudeau has now refreshed that promise and given these open net fish farms along the whole coast of British Columbia 5 years to move inland. Right now, at least they made that promise, and it's caused all kinds of a stink. But what happened there was the the indigenous native culture along the coast, which is pretty significant, got really organized over this thing. And they've made a big push in saying what it's done. And there's no question, it's the one factor that has reduced these immense runs of wild salmon to trickles. On the West Coast, it's hard to believe. It's hard to believe that this could have happened. Even the Fraser River, which used to have a run, the Adams River was a tributary to the Fraser, used to have a run of 8 million sockeye fish. It's now just a few thousand. It's drastic consequence. And the only thing that's changed is salmon farming, right? It's the only thing that has changed. Commercial fishing pressure has been more or less the same. And again, you've got these, you've got Alaska to point to, which has no salmon farming on, and they still boast multi-million runs of fish. So there's no mystery why the west coast of Scotland's salmon is disappearing. It's not disappearing. There are salmon there, all right, but they're all farmed fish now. Sorry, this could help. This isn't. It's going to take too long. But for instance, there's a study done a couple of years ago of the Loch Lomond fishery, which is a system. I mean, it's quite a substantial system. Used to have very healthy runs of salmon. Still has some. But 94% of the fish returning to the Lomond system are farm fish, or escapees. There's almost no wild fish left, right? All the other wild fish, of course, have been genetically modified by interbreeding with farm fish. So that has actually happened. You can't go back from that now. You can't turn that clock back. So it's gone a bit quiet, but I think we mentioned this just in a recent email, Pete, with you, is that the problem is people have just got used to eating this stuff. It's in all the restaurants, all of them. Everybody buys it, everybody eats it, everybody likes it. So it's like chicken now, only expensive. It's a treat, and it's everywhere. It's everywhere. So I don't think we're going to dial that back, but hopefully the things that are happening in the United States and Canada now, and Chile, and there's big pushes going on in Norway to start reducing this, and because there's so many other worldwide effects of this feeding salmon with wild fish for food that they're taking off the coast of Africa and things like that it just can't go on forever. But I think the wild salmon in most areas are taking a real whipping. Because of it. Luckily, we've still got, the north coast of Russia. We've still got decent runs, even along the west coast of Scotland. There's still, you call them remnant populations, but they're significant. And you've had, various places in the world where I think salmon could definitely reestablish in some of these rivers, but I think it's going to be many years before they start, doing anything serious, say in Scotland anyway. We'll see what happens in Canada, though. So everybody should just keep an eye on what's happening in Canada regarding salmon farms. It's very encouraging for me anyway. See that, but I probably won't see the positive results of this, maybe even in my lifetime. But I think eventually, because I don't think it is sustainable. It's just not sustainable in the way that's done now. We can't keep it up. Anyway, that's salmon farming.
Yeah, well, thanks for your thoughts on that. And also, I think about often what happens in North America filters across here. Yeah. So my hope is perhaps that might start to happen. So I will keep my fingers very tightly crossed for that. Can you, for our listeners, if they don't know it already, remind us of your book titles, please?
Well, the first book I wrote was called Trout Hunting, The Pursuit of Happiness. And it's been out of print for quite a few years now, but people can still find it in the Aid books, a couple of used books, but it's getting pretty pricey. And I think that's why this German chap has decided to look into republishing. So you never know. Maybe we can, if a re-edited version of a revised Trout Hunting might come out. The other book is more of a technical one, I think, because my friend John Dean in New Zealand more or less pressured me into writing a more technical fishing book, so I did. It's not entirely technical, but it is pretty much that way. about trout behavior and why I think certain things. And that's called What Trout Want. It's a stupid title, but it was Rob Sloan, he's the publisher of Fly Life in Australia, suggested that title. He says, "Why don't you just call it that?" So I did. So What Trout Want is the recent one. It's still for sale. You get it on Amazon for, I don't know, 16 quid or something. So if you want to know what I think about trout, there it is.
And they're a must if you can track them down. I was looking at Kokibundu yesterday and couldn't see one on there. Trout hunting, certainly. But yeah. Oh, I've got one. I got it when it came out, so I've got a copy. Yeah, absolutely. I have one. So I love the book, and I can't recommend it highly enough, folks. If you can track them down, either of them, you will learn something. So I can't endorse them highly enough. So please search those out if you can. Also, Fly Life as well is a magnificent magazine as well. So if you're looking for something a little bit different to read as well, have a look at that as well. And I'll always shout about Fly Fish Journal out of the US as well. So if you're looking for fishing stuff to read, Bob's books, but also, check out Fly Life and Fly Fish Journal as well. Bob, this is the dreaded question. We're going to end on the dreaded question. We have a playlist of songs on Spotify called the Fly Culture Road Trip Mix, which has just about everything musical-wise. Have you got a song for me that I can add to the playlist, please?
Wow, right. You'd be sorry.
Go on.
I've got a kind of a country thing.
Oh, we've got plenty on there. That's good news.
You're an Emmylou Harris fan?
Yep.
Well, okay. Well, let's pick one of her old ones. I really want to hear just a great song. Is Boulder to Birmingham by Emmylou Harris. Try that.
I will load that up. I'm just writing it down now, and that will go up very, very shortly. So thank you for that. Bob, we've spoken well over an hour now. I've enjoyed every second of it. It was exactly the podcast I hoped it would be. Having spoken to you before, I knew it was going to be excellent. But it's just been wonderful to catch up with you, to talk about so many different and interesting subjects that I thoroughly enjoyed seeing your view on as well. Streamers, yeah, I think they're probably. I bought some in Italy, so there's one keeps looking at me every time I open my dry fly box. I put it in there, I think, as some form as reminder to say, go on, get it out again. So I do fish them, and I've not fished them for a little bit. So perhaps it's time to readdress that a little bit. But thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me and being a guest on the Fly Culture podcast today.
Oh, anytime, Pete. We'll do it again. Okay. Bye-bye.
I would love that very much. Well, everyone, this has been another episode of the Fly Culture podcast. I hope you've enjoyed this one as much as me. As ever, there will never be any charge for these podcasts. I just love talking fishing with people and hope you enjoy listening to their stories too. So everybody, this has been another episode of the Fly Culture podcast. Thank you so much for listening.
The Fly Culture podcast is brought to you in association with Fly Culture, a quarterly published magazine owned and run by fly anglers. When it comes to fly fishing, we've got you covered.